Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your source material and, well, we try to extract the absolute maximum context, connection, and crucial insight.
And today we are embarking on a truly ambitious mission.
I think ambitious is the right word. We're tracing the soul's really profound and, frankly, often paradoxical journey toward complete, unreserved union with the divine.
That's right. We are diving deep, and I mean deep, into the mystical theology of Madame Guyon. She was a figure whose, let's say, radical approach to spirituality caused both widespread devotion and some pretty intense persecution back in the 17th century.
And our source material for this is very specific.
It is. We're drawing from excerpts of her foundational work, Union with God. And the kind of thing here, is that this isn't some abstract theoretical theology.
No.
Guyon insisted she was mapping out the actual, practical, lived Christian experience.
And her thesis is just staggering. It's that this transformation is a multi-stage process, and it's so complex that it necessarily requires the thorough death and really the annihilation of the natural self to achieve any kind of true spiritual life.
It's a staggering claim right out of the gate.
Absolutely. The source material establishes this core premise immediately. It defines the goal as the union between the, and I'm quoting here, impure, unrighteous, sinful human.
And the holy, righteous, good divine.
And that's not just a large difference. I mean, that's an ontological chasm that needs bridging.
It is. The source actually calls this union the most marvelous and honorable miracle in the universe.
Okay, so if that's the miracle, what's the mechanism? How does something like that even happen?
Well, that's the crucial question, isn't it? And Guyon insists it is purely 100% a result of God's overwhelming mercy and love. It all begins when he grants his life to believers through the Holy Spirit.
So the Spirit comes to dwell in the innermost part of the human spirit.
Right, but the key is that the dwelling is only the start of the relationship. It's not the end goal.
Ah, I see. So that's just laying the foundation.
Exactly. That initial divine presence is the foundation. The actual process of achieving union, the complete functional oneness that requires God to subject the natural part of the person, what Guyon calls the soul, to a long and extremely rigorous period of what she calls complex dealing and stripping.
Dealing and stripping.
Until that self is thoroughly broken and ultimately killed. It's like a divine demolition job.
A divine demolition job.
Wow.
All aimed at purifying the vessel.
That's the idea.
So we're talking about a spiritual path that's paved with systematic suffering, deprivation, and loss. Not comfort or certainty or, continuous emotional high points.
Exactly the opposite. And, this isn't just some obscure historical footnote for modern theology students.
No, there's a fascinating, really practical historical nugget tied to the impact of these specific principles.
Yes, the historical influence is profound. You see it especially in early Protestant revivalism. John Wesley, for example.
The founder of Methodism.
The founder of Methodism, who lived in the 18th century, he utilized the principles laid out in this very book.
And he credited this path.
He credited this specific pathway of dying to the self with enabling him to live what he called a sinless life.
Which, to be clear, doesn't mean he was perfect. It means a life wholly dedicated to God's will, free from intentional self-will.
Exactly. And for him, it was for a sustained period, and it led to him becoming the powerful servant of God that the source describes. So it just goes to show that major historical figures viewed this really difficult mystical path as intensely practical for achieving profound holiness.
So, okay, our mission today is to trace these stages precisely as Guyon maps them out, from that initial rebirth all the way to complete union. And we need to provide the deep context necessary to understand this difficult and often counterintuitive process.
And before we can chart the journey, we absolutely need the map key.
The map key. I like that. The translator's notes give us these critical definitions of the human constitution.
We have to define the three parts of what the source calls the natural man. That is, the human as born of Adam. If we misunderstand the parts, we can't possibly understand the mechanism of death and rebirth.
Okay, let's start with the simplest one. The body.
Right. The body is the outermost part. It connects us to the material world. It's made of earth elements. It's the part everyone understands.
Easy enough. Then you have the two internal components, and these are the ones that are just central to Guyon's framework. First, the spirit.
The spirit is the innermost part. It's the most profound interior seat of divine connection.
And it's designed for what, exactly?
It's designed specifically for worship, for feeling God, and for communication with the divine. It has three defined functions: conscience, communion, and intuition, or, direct, immediate knowing.
And this is the part of the person that becomes completely inert or dies when sin enters the picture.
Correct. And it is reactivated or reborn by the Holy Spirit when a person is saved. This reborn spirit then becomes the new divine center of the person.
Which brings us to the third part, the soul. And this is where the whole stripping process is focused.
Yes. The Source defines the soul as the middle part, and critically, the representative of the self. This is the operational center of our personhood, where we experience our self-awareness.
Our ego, basically.
Precisely. The soul has three critical functions: thought, emotion, and will.
And Guyon's understanding of the fall of man is fascinatingly structured around these three things.
It really is. The fall started with errant thought, which led to corrupted emotion, which then drove the will towards selfish action, and that ultimately caused sin.
So therefore, the entire long process of transformation and union centers completely on the systematic death, destruction, and then the subsequent divine resurrection of the soul.
It is the ego, the self-driven personality, that has to be eliminated for union to occur.
That structural definition, that gives us the blueprint for the entire battleground. The moment the spirit is reborn, it immediately sets up an internal conflict with the soul.
A conflict, yes. The spirit demands that those three functions, thought, emotion, and will, come down, incline toward it, and ultimately obey it.
And that's phase one. That's the commencement of that internal redirection.
Exactly.
So with those definitions in place, let's look at the beginning of this journey. Phase one is the foundation and inward turn. We start with rebirth.
Right. The touch point of the Holy Spirit reviving the human spirit.
That's the signal that the transformation has begun.
It is. But simply having a reborn spirit isn't enough for union. The crucial next step is the conscious, continuous act of turning inward.
And the Source clarifies that this transformation is much deeper than just turning from sin to grace, which is obviously necessary for salvation.
Much deeper. It is turning from the created natural man, with all its external activities and thoughts, toward God, who now resides in the absolute silent center of the person.
So this sounds like a fundamental shift in where the believer is even looking for spiritual reality.
It is.
You have to realize that God can only truly be found, enjoyed, and delighted in within the deepest, most quiet part of yourself. Not externally through, public ministry or intense study or elaborate rituals.
The search is over. The seeking has to become internal abiding.
And this leads us to this surprising, almost counterintuitive instruction about how we cooperate with God's grace, this concept of passive cooperation.
This is a huge point. The only action you can take, the only effort required, is to withdraw from all external things, from all that self-driven activity, and retreat inward.
So you have to continuously and steadfastly adhere to the God who is inside you.
But that adherence is characterized by passivity, not striving.
Okay, I have to pause here. This is the first place where I feel some real intellectual friction.
Go on.
If the goal is union, which implies a profound, active relationship, how can the human effort be defined as passive withdrawal? I mean, isn't choosing to withdraw an active choice in itself?
That's a critical question, and it really gets to the heart of mystical theology.
Right.
Guyon argues that the soul, with its flawed thought, emotion, and will, is simply incapable of achieving genuine union through its own activity, no matter how righteous that activity might appear on the surface.
Because any effort that originates from the created self introduces self-will and pride.
Which are impurities. So the only way the soul can truly cooperate is by stepping out of the way.
It's an active choice.
Yeah.
To be passive.
Exactly. The active work of transformation is entirely God's, and it's located in the reborn spirit. The soul's job is simply to stop blocking the internal flow.
To make this more understandable, the Source uses the magnetic analogy. Can you explain how this passivity works dynamically?
Sure. God possesses an attracting virtue, like a kind of magnetic gravity, because he is the divine center. He draws the soul toward him effortlessly because he is already placed in your center.
So the spiritual realm, being a higher reality, has a pull that's far more definitive than natural gravity.
Exactly. So if you are quiet and unblocked, you just accelerate toward that spiritual center without needing to generate your own energy.
It's like the air purification example they use. Polluted air being drawn upward by the sun, becoming thin and clean. The air's only contribution is being passively lifted and acted upon.
It's a process of being acted upon, not acting yourself. The transformation is described as easy and natural once that initial turning has begun. Strenuous, self-driven efforts are actually counterproductive.
Because they re-engage the flawed soul's mechanism.
Right. The focus is to be continuously and steadfastly available to the indwelling divine life.
And what are the immediate benefits of this inward life?
Well, turning inward becomes the source of the soul's greatest joy. And not an outward joy of achievement, but a deep inward contentment that establishes a solid foundation for all the spiritual progress that comes later.
I do appreciate the practical application here.
Huh.
How to deal with disturbance.
Yeah.
The advice is so starkly different from modern self-help. When emotions like worry, anxiety, or anger are disturbed, the counsel isn't to analyze them or fight them with brute force of will.
No, instead, a complete inward retreat to God will instantly weaken or extinguish them.
And the sources warn that trying to resist them otherwise by force of will or engaging in distraction, that only stimulates them further.
Because the self-driven resistance itself is a form of self-activity. When you try to crush your anger, you're still fueling the mechanism of the soul, your thought and your will.
So by retreating inward, you're redirecting all energy away from the battlefield and toward the spiritual core. You're effectively starving the negative emotion of the attention it needs to survive.
Precisely.
This heavy reliance on the internal intuitive core leads directly to this idea of the superiority of simple faith over knowledge. Why must knowledge, intellectual seeking, be abandoned for intimate union?
The source warns that some believers rely solely on intellectual knowledge and rational processes to approach God.
They might be brilliant theologians.
They may be. They may even taste spiritual communion. But they will never achieve intimate union unless they abandon that reliance on their own created intellect and touch God within using the Spirit's intuition.
The knowledge seeker is slow and cautious, right? They need rational evidence to be convinced of every single step.
Whereas the simple believer relies entirely on inner guidance, what Guyon calls the intuition of life or direct knowing. They follow a path that often seems unclear to the rational mind, but it's wholly natural and guided by the inward spirit.
In this simple believer, they progress far faster in the spiritual realm than those who rely only on intellectual illumination and rational evidence.
It's a great irony, isn't it? The person who looks less outwardly educated in spiritual matters is often the one further along the path of real, functional transformation.
Because the intuitive path is direct, while the intellectual path requires constant, laborious vetting by the soul.
Exactly, and this difference manifests in the experience itself. This is the shift in experience. The path of faith, which involves abandoning the need for intellectual understanding and emotional fervor, can feel profoundly, dry.
Yes, dry. It lacks the excitement of intellectual illumination or emotional passion. True encounters with God, Guyon observes, often happen in stillness, not during these high emotional peaks.
And here is a major paradox that confuses so many believers.
Which is?
As joy deepens in the spirit, feelings and emotional highs often diminish in the soul. So when joy is less obviously felt, the spirit's intimacy with the Lord actually increases.
So the believer may feel dry, yet still possess a profound, deep-seated joy. They're receiving light deep within without even realizing it consciously or intellectually processing it.
This quiet, subtle joy is the marker of true spiritual progress. It's a steady spirit. The passionate, emotional believer who's always seeking confirmation through feelings is easily swayed and volatile.
Like the Apostle Peter.
Exactly, often impulsive. The quiet, simple believer is more like the Apostle John, characterized by this steady, profound love that isn't dependent on fluctuating emotions. They're submitted to God's will without the need for conscious affirmation.
So phase one is essentially achieving the turn and establishing the Spirit's supreme management over the natural man, ensuring the natural man becomes a subordinate.
Yes, but you warned earlier that this is only a surface death. The soul is subdued, but it's not yet annihilated.
Right.
The natural man has ceased its external disturbances and its fight for dominance. The soul is quiet and respectful. It's constantly breathing out love. It's practicing high virtues and strict self-denial.
It might seem complete.
It seems complete, but it's actually highly dangerous because the self is still intact. It's just hidden under a layer of spiritual achievement.
And this brings us to phase two.
This brings us to phase two.
So phase two, the purification of the soul, is where the systematic destruction really begins. If phase one was about withdrawal, phase two is about being attacked and stripped.
Indeed. After that initial quietness, the shock arrives. This is the illusion of freedom. The believer, having achieved what they see as significant victories over external temptations, assumes they have lasting freedom. They believe the enemy, the carnal self, is finally defeated.
But then suddenly, and often violently, new, subtle weaknesses and old, deeply rooted habits reappear.
Which demonstrates that the control they gained in phase one was only superficial. They subdued the outward manifestation of self-will, but the self-will itself, the root, was still present.
And this forces a crucial spiritual realization. Weakness is progress.
It's a stunning paradox. As the believer advances further toward God, they must be stripped of self-reliance. And this is achieved because as God becomes stronger within, the self becomes consciously weaker. The soul's spiritual fighting power actually declines.
Let's elaborate on that paradox. Why does increasing spiritual strength have to lead to conscious weakness?
Because the soul, which is the seat of the ego, interprets spiritual victory as its own merit. It develops this hidden form of pride, or high moral self-conceit.
So if the believer could overcome these re-emerged weaknesses, using their own moral strength, even strength aided by grace, they would cling to that success as a personal achievement.
And God has to allow the believer to fail. He has to expose them to their deepest flaws, so they realize that self-effort, however well-intended, is always tainted by pride.
So the believer realizes they cannot overcome these external weaknesses, even with the aid of grace and fervent prayer. The soul, which had been strong in the past, must now be broken.
The source is absolutely clear on this. The self cannot effectively deal with its own external weaknesses. This is God's work alone, and it's designed to thoroughly cleanse the soul by annihilating its capacity for self-management.
And the instrument for this divine breaking is the cross. This is suffering, but it's suffering with a very specific function.
God distributes specific crosses or sufferings in life. And critically, these are not chosen by the believer. You can't pick your own suffering for spiritual growth.
No, they're assigned by God's authority.
Assigned. And these sufferings lengthen, they increase, and they become heavier, forming a continuous, painful pressure cooker designed to purify the soul's relationship with the indwelling Lord.
And what might these crosses look like?
Oh, they could manifest as social humiliation, financial ruin, a physical ailment, or deep misunderstanding from loved ones. The common denominator is that they attack the sense of self-worth and control.
So the outcome of this period must be the painful realization of complete weakness and poverty.
It forces the cessation of all concepts of self-control. The breaking has to be so thorough that the believer stops trying to fix themselves or even praying for relief from their defects.
Only when you are weak enough, when the shell of the self is completely broken and shattered,
Does God step in to achieve a more thorough cleansing than you could have ever accomplished through self-denial or active virtue? It's the moment the weak kernel truly breaks so the life inside can finally emerge.
as if this wasn't enough. Phase 2 continues with the second major mechanism, the process of stripping and loss, or the deprivation of gifts.
Yes.
This is where everything you thought was good about your spiritual life is deliberately removed from your conscious awareness.
Advancement is caused by conscious losing. All previous outward and inward spiritual progress, all the virtues you acknowledged, all your perceived merits, everything is stripped away and deemed unimportant. And this is profoundly disorienting.
Why is this loss necessary, though? If you genuinely achieved a virtue through grace, why must it be taken away?
Because the soul is insidious. It will cling to the memory of a past achievement or the feeling of current grace as a form of hidden merit. It's a security blanket.
So if you can remember, I was courageous yesterday. That memory sustains the pride of the self. This stripping removes that very foundation.
And this loss primarily happens in consciousness. Even virtues we acknowledged, courage, wisdom, patience, they just disappear from our awareness. And this is accompanied by the hiding of the spirit.
So the spirit's existence itself becomes undetectable by the soul's feelings.
It is retired inward, closely sealed up. And this hiding is necessary for the death and complete loss of the self to be realized. If you could still feel the spirit's comfort or guidance, the self would just cling to that feeling as the last refuge of merit.
Guyon provides a concise summary of the 4 steps of the journey's purpose through this stripping process.
Yes. Step 1, being led from external matters into the internal self. That's phase 1.
Step 2, clearly sensing the spirit's initial presence.
Step 3, knowing the loss of feeling, that dryness, despite the spirit's continued presence.
And finally, the most painful step, painfully comprehending that you have lost everything: faith, hope, courage, virtue, and all sense of your own spiritual value.
That's terrifying.
To consciously feel that you are losing spiritual ground even though you're supposed to be advancing, it's just wow.
It is the deepest form of spiritual poverty, and this includes the loss of ability and self-perception. The believer loses the conscious ability to perform countless spiritual tasks.
Maybe they can no longer preach with fervor or pray structured prayers effectively.
Right. And they even lose the sense of their own value or their spiritual gifts. The source notes that outwardly they might resemble a non-Christian, stripped of both their external temperament and their valuable internal qualities.
This prepares them for the deepest crisis.
It does. When everything is stripped, the believer falls into the most dangerous state, intense temptation and trial. Their resistance capacity is gone. The last refuge, the evidence of God's goodness in their life, is withdrawn.
They lose faith in God, they lose faith in their own spirit's regeneration, and they lose faith in their own basic nature. They feel utterly defenseless, useless, and maybe even damned.
This is the 0 point. They have been brought to absolute despair, to a defenseless surrender. But it is here that the miracle of realization occurs.
What's that?
The believer recognizes that the powerful enemy, the hardship, the continuous painful persecution of the self is actually their closest, most faithful friend.
They realize this deprivation, this stripping, this agonizing purification comes directly from the loving Lord for the precise purpose of annihilating the self.
The instrument of pain is the instrument of love.
And the refinement continues with one final complex paradox in this phase, the paradox of relapse.
Yes. The believer might feel their natural self is resurrecting or that they are relapsing into old, crude habits. The natural flesh seems to revive.
Why would God allow this apparent backsliding?
This is God's profound wisdom and grace at work. He allows the natural flesh to revive, not necessarily into sin, but into subtle self-centered activities, to expose the soul's last remaining stronghold.
Which is?
High moral self-conceit, self-righteousness. This pride was previously hidden by their spiritual success and self-denial, so God uses this natural weakness as apparent moral failure as an antidote to the soul's elevation, ensuring the self dies completely, even to its own perceived goodness.
So having been thoroughly hammered and stripped of every self-reliance, we arrive at the absolute 0 point of the self, phase 3, the death of the will. We move past the breaking and stripping and reach the annihilation of the self-life.
Yes, the self-life has been beaten down by relentless enemies and internal crosses until there is no capacity left to work, struggle, or even think, only to collapse into the arms of divine love.
The natural man has been overwhelmed.
Completely overwhelmed by the superior spiritual forces aligned against its self-will.
How does Guyon define this death in functional terms? It's death as absolute indifference.
Death means the self is no longer present in its operations. It cannot feel pain, worry, or consciously think of itself. It is a state of cold indifference, but an indifference born of purity, not apathy.
Where there is no longer any expression or claim of self-opinion, preference, or will.
Right. This cold indifference is the soul's spiritual freedom. If life is proven by having a will, by wanting something or opposing something, then the dead soul has no will left. Everything is the same to it.
It has reached a state where it knows neither dislike nor liking in spiritual or natural matters.
All things become indifferent because the mechanism that processes preference, the self-serving will, is gone.
The translator's note here is crucial. It emphasizes the will's dominance.
It does. The human will is the primary representative of the self, the metaphorical emperor of the soul. And even the most correct, good, and respectable human will, the desire to serve God, for instance, must be negated.
Why?
Because as long as the goodness originates from the created being, it carries the residue of the self. Only the divine will can be operational.
But if the will is the emperor of the soul and it has to die, how is the believer supposed to choose the path of passive cooperation in the first place? I mean, isn't that an inherent contradiction?
That is the ultimate paradox of grace. The initial choice to turn inward in phase 1 is made by the soul's will, driven by the conscience and the initial illumination of the spirit.
Okay.
However, once that turn is made, the soul must willingly submit to the subsequent process of having its will annihilated.
It's like stepping onto a spiritual conveyor belt. You choose to get on, but once you're moving, you are no longer in control of the speed or direction.
A perfect analogy. The soul's initial self-directed good will must ultimately commit suicide for the divine will to fully take over.
So the death of the will is achieved. The self is annihilated, but the source warns this is not the end of suffering. This leads to the persistence of suffering.
I know. If the self is dead, who is left to suffer?
Exactly.
Well, the soul has not yet fully entered God, even if the will is gone. Suffering continues as a painful awakening, which is necessary to eliminate residual stains, the image or residue of the person that still lingers.
So even after the conscious will is gone, there are subtle habits, mental frameworks, or ways of reacting that still originate from the created being.
And those residual stains, anything originating from the created being, cannot be accepted by the creator. They must vanish.
The source emphasizes that for union to be complete, the loss of everything the self possessed, every mental and emotional residue, is absolutely necessary.
And this is only gradually achieved through the experience of the resurrection life that follows. The suffering is no longer purifying the will, since it's dead, but clearing the final, subtle layers of self-identity.
So once the natural self and its will are dead, the soul has experienced death and is cast into the embrace of God. This is the transition to union. The internal parts are truly united, and there is no interval between the soul and God.
Yes, but this brings us to the mystery. Though the internal parts are truly united, the believer does not consciously recognize this fact or immediately enjoy the benefits of union.
Not until God brings the resurrection life into them.
Exactly. The union is real, but the conscious experience lags behind the spiritual fact.
The bride analogy perfectly illustrates this unconscious union.
It does. A young bride, overwhelmed by the intensity of love, may faint in her husband's arms. The union is established, they are physically united, but she is unconscious.
Only when he calls her to wake up does she recover consciousness and realize she possesses him and is possessed by him.
Similarly, the soul is united with God, but the full, joyful, and conscious enjoyment follows only after the resurrection phase begins. The goal is possession, not just consciousness of possession.
Phase 4 brings that conscious awareness, the realization of what has occurred. Resurrection, expansion, and absolute quietness. The pain of purification is finally yielding its fruit.
When the believer is fully possessed by God, they experience the resurrected soul. They find profound, consistent joy in weakness because they're no longer dependent on their own strength.
They're filled with divine capacity, God's will, God's thought, God's demands.
They are completely and effortlessly governed by God in every aspect of their life.
And what emerges from this death is a profound internal change, the living seed.
Upon resurrection, a living seed or a bud of divine life appears within, expanding from the inner person outward. Guyon connects this directly to the biblical statement, "It pleased God to reveal his Son in me."
So the indwelling Christ, previously sealed up in the Spirit, now begins to express himself through the soul, which has been thoroughly emptied and remade.
Yes, and the nature of change is described as the soul being received into God and gradually fundamentally changing.
Guyon uses the analogy of food being changed within the body.
The soul is transformed by its continual contact with the divine. The human image of the soul is destroyed and replaced by God's image. And this is a continuous, lifelong process where the soul becomes so rich by contact with the Lord that it transforms into the nature of the Lord himself.
So God does not allow the soul's faculties, thought, emotion, and will to remain dead forever. They are renewed and made active again.
Yes, but the key distinction is that they are renewed commensurate with the growth of love in the Spirit. Their activity appears to be the soul's, but it's now entirely managed by God, conforming perfectly to his desires.
Having been thoroughly shattered and remade.
The thoughts are God's thoughts. The desires are God's desires. The will is active, but it is now the divine will operating seamlessly through the human vessel.
This transformation leads us to the conceptual pinnacle of this stage, the attainment of absolute quietness.
This is defined as the last stage of the spiritual road, where the work of change is complete and the methods of purification have ended. Now only growth remains.
Unlimited expansion and increasing abundance.
The self is completely surrendered and the spiritual life flows unimpeded.
And the core characteristic of this state is pure love, far exceeding any ordinary human, natural, or parental affection. It is love that expects nothing in return and requires no confirmation.
And paradoxically, this pure love and quietness leads to the abandonment of prayer. Now, this shocks people who believe prayer must be a constant, active striving.
How can a highly advanced saint lose the ability to pray?
Well, faith has led to such deep quietness that the believer reaches a point of absolute stillness and loses all reliance on the ability to form structured or formulated prayers.
The power of dictated intellectual prayer is taken away.
It is. They can't even regulate or dictate prayer times because that would be an act of self-will, attempting to manage the spiritual life. They feel incapable of producing a good prayer.
But the practice of prayer returns in a completely new form, the new prayer.
Yes, because the soul has been remade. The prayer that returns is extremely easy, continuous, and marked by a sweet, noble, extremely spiritual feeling. And the focus shifts fundamentally
From enjoying God seeking him for personal fulfillment.
to losing oneself and God abiding in him for his sake alone. Prayer becomes the very breath of the soul, unconscious, immediate, and constant.
Guyon is careful to contrast this final state with the earlier, painful stillness. She defines two types of quietness.
Yes, the first is the quietness in the dead state, the stillness that occurs just after the will dies but before resurrection.
In the dead state, the soul is still, but it is often bored, chaotic, and lacking feeling. The believer may only pray with their lips or by force of thought.
Because the natural faculties are inert and have not yet been revived by divine life. This quietness is painful, empty, and dry.
But the second is the quietness in the resurrected state.
Here, the soul is still, but it is full of abundance, purity, and infused with what the Source describes as an ointment that flows over the feelings. Joy is flawless and unhindered. This is the quietness of absolute purity, perfect submission, and realized union.
I can hear a listener asking right now, if I am in the resurrected state, is the suffering finally over?
For purification related to the self, yes. But here is an entirely new dimension of suffering, a selfless suffering, intercessory suffering.
What does that mean?
Advanced saints are typically free from bitter suffering related to their own purification, but they must suffer for immature believers who are still stuck in that painful stage of being purified.
That is a radical concept. You are suffering for someone else's spiritual refinement. How does that even work?
It's explained as the transfer mechanism. God transmits his will specifically, the necessary painful experience, or cross to the immature believer through the suffering endured by the advanced saint.
So the advanced saint acts as an essential, pure bridge until the younger believer can accept the pain directly from God.
They become a sacrificial instrument, a kind of lightning rod, absorbing the spiritual difficulty that the younger believer is not yet strong enough to endure directly without collapsing completely.
So they're bearing the burdens of the spiritually weak.
Precisely. The suffering is not punitive, it is purely intercessory. And the Source notes that once the immature believer is ready to receive that painful purification directly, the burden of suffering is immediately lifted from the advanced saint.
It highlights the deeply communal and interdependent nature of the spiritual body.
Absolutely. Which brings us to phase 5, which is called clothed in God. This marks the full consummation of the inner work and the transition to a life entirely managed by the divine.
This describes a state of life in constant permeation.
God's life permeates the soul, filling it fully with divine essence. The Source uses the fish analogy to try and explain the continuous nature of this experience.
The believer lives in God without interruption, like a fish in the ocean, never leaving it for a moment.
And critically, this occurs even in the most ordinary, simple circumstances, while cleaning, working, or resting. There is no longer a spiritual life and a secular life. There is only a life lived in God, fully permeated.
And when this stage is reached, the saint is so simple and focused that they never have a thought for themselves. They are entirely focused on God's will. And yet,
Yes.
this is where the final, most severe cross appears.
Paradoxically, yes. Their cross reaches its most severe degree here. They're often placed in despised, humiliating, and confusing circumstances.
They might face public disgrace, intense physical weakness, or misunderstanding from religious leaders.
Why? Despite being God's most beloved, this final public humiliation confirms the utter destruction of self-reputation and self-opinion, ensuring that all glory is manifestly God's.
This allows for the complete transformation to be finalized. The saint puts on Christ's nature, affections, and sufferings.
And by participating in the reality of Christ's redemption, they truly understand how God produces his children. Their natural qualities are saturated with the divine. The inner transformation process is completed, resulting in the merger of spirit and soul.
The spirit and soul are almost unified, the Source says. Every internal part appears to become divine because the soul has fully entered God and has been destroyed and recreated in his image.
And this union is followed by an amazing outward expanding quality expansion. The believer participates in God's infinity, experiencing an outward expanding scope of spiritual reality.
The entire earth feels like a small point compared to the scope of this experience and their identification with God.
Their internal life has transcended earthly limitation.
And the most important mechanism is the perfection of the will. We reach the unified will.
The will of the Spirit replaces the believer's will so naturally that the believer genuinely cannot distinguish whether it is their will that follows God's or simply God's will acting through them.
So the initial human will, which committed suicide back in phase 3, is now resurrected and perfectly aligned.
The will of the Spirit becomes the believer's living law, acted out effortlessly.
Finally, the advanced saint's purpose shifts entirely to ministry, specifically helping others onto this difficult path.
Yes, the transformed believer is uniquely equipped to lead others onto the same narrow path of spirit guidance, having walked it themselves. However, the rule of guidance for them is extremely strict.
Which is,
They must only speak on general principles of the inward life, actively avoiding the criticism of others' specific faults.
why the restriction on criticizing specific faults?
Because criticizing specific faults re-engages the soul of the immature believer. It causes them to focus on self-effort and moral striving, which blocks the deeper work of stripping.
So the advanced saint must encourage the inward turn and passive cooperation. They can't be used for this purpose if they are still occupied with self-judgment or judging others.
Their purity dictates their ministry methodology.
This has been an extraordinary journey, tracing the cost of this mystical union. Let's quickly review the major steps and the essential paradoxes.
We saw the journey begin with the necessary withdrawal and passive cooperation, the soul choosing to step aside. This led to the painful phase 2, the stripping of gifts and the suffering of the cross.
Leading to that profound, counterintuitive realization that weakness is progress.
Then came the annihilation of the self in phase 3, the painful death of the will to achieve absolute indifference, resulting in an initial unconscious union with God.
And the final emergence in phase 4 and 5. The resurrected soul, filled with the divine life, operating in absolute quietness, resulting in the complete permeation and unification of the spirit and soul.
Where the will becomes perfectly and seamlessly God's will. The entire system is designed to remove any possible reliance on the created self-eliminating, self-control, self-opinion, self-will, and even self-perceived spiritual merit.
The cost is extreme, the path is narrow, and the destruction of everything we typically value. Self-knowledge, self-direction, emotional certainty is mandatory. This ultimate state is one of absolute passivity, loyalty, and obedience.
And that profound state raises a significant question for us today.
What's that?
If the goal of this radical spiritual journey is the systematic destruction and abandonment of the self, its will, its knowledge, and its feelings, what does this radical philosophy imply about contemporary cultural values centered on self-assertion, emotional fulfillment, personal agency, and the aggressive pursuit of external achievement?
Very pointed question.
What might you be clinging to? That personal, unique identity defined by your efforts that Guyon suggests must be stripped away entirely to find your deepest, most divine center.
Something to mull or explore on your own.